This week, we welcome back to the show the one and only, the prolific, the mysterious man in Turkey, the one and only Peter Mark Adams. Welcome back, sir. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Gordon. Lovely to see you again.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, most important question first. How's the boss? How's Kenzie?
Very well. She's incredibly busy at the moment with some European connections. So yeah, great, wonderful.
Oh,
Nothing to
awesome. Very
complain
good.
about.
Nice. All right. Well, we are here to talk about magical, mysterious, and curious survivals, which has been a
Mm,
theme through much of your work. Uh, and
yes.
and in this case, the latest book is called, let me get this right, Sanctum of Kronos. I like that.
Yeah. Hagia
That's really
Sophia.
good. Yeah, Hagia Sophia, Sanctum of Kronos. Now,
Mm,
um, what I wanted to open the discussion with is, I guess, setting the landscape for the cosmology that survived, right? Because we can find some of it. We can find some of it in Game of Saturn. Certainly in this book, it doesn't just survive into magnificent architecture.
yeah.
It but that's plainly evident in what we're looking at, right? So what I want to do is to kind of trace out the thing that actually survived before we tell the
Yeah.
story of the survival. So
Mm,
let's start with a few uh, these are easy leading questions, I guess. We'll start with this one. It's my favorite. So, what's
okay.
Neoplatonism, Peter?
Well, it's a 19th century scholarly term that completely distorts our understanding of the development of both metaphysical and theurgical work in late antiquity. Okay. So, what we seem to be faced with is a text based scholarly understanding of a practical tradition that grew out of the mysteries. Okay. So, you can split Neoplatonism into three threads. One of them goes from Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria in the early centuries um, via Plotinus to Rome and his student Porphyry. And that's a very heavily or densely textual tradition. But the other side of it was Iamblichus and
Mm.
Proclus. And both of those were practicing theurgists. And their connections stem directly out of the mystery traditions, sanctuary based mystery cults of antiquity. And what I've sought to do is to resituate their thought and their uh, practical work in that context, because it is not a part of an academic tradition whatsoever, despite the fact that that's how their writings have been treated for the last 100 years or so. That is not what they're about. So, and you find in Proclus's writing, he actually dismisses the metaphysical part of the teaching program that they had. You know, he says, if it was down to me, I'd burn all the books except Chaldean oracles and Plato's Timaeus, because they distract from the essential part of the work. And so, really, I'd like to talk about how this tradition grew out of the mystery tradition, because it was a
Yeah.
pivotal moment in European esoteric history when the sanctuaries gave way to kind of private institutions. You could say that it was the hinge point, the birth of the Western esoteric tradition as we know it, when the sanctuaries were closed down by Theodosius and then largely destroyed at the end of the 4th century. And the last hierophant of Eleusis, the last member of the priestly lineage, which stretched back to 8th century BCE, at least, he, faced with the destruction of the sanctuary, was determined that the lineage would not be stamped out and that they had a spiritual responsibility to convey it to a new age. And essentially, the story of this School of Athens, which has been mislabeled, a Platonic academy, which it was not, is the story of how that initiatory tradition was preserved through Christian persecution throughout the 5th and into the 6th centuries.
All right. So
So the
it's
connection to
there's
the Hagia
like
Sophia. Okay, sorry.
yeah, there's a. I
No.
just want to situate more in that before we move along with it, right? Because the sort of plot twist in this podcast episode about survivals from that era is basically everything's a survival from that era, right? So
Yeah.
when you're talking about um, the debate, dare I say, over theurgy, that's right there at the beginning of Christianity itself, which is like, do you actually need to do ritual? Is Jesus a magician? Like,
Yeah.
in those first few centuries, this is all being hashed out. And so we have a couple of things. The nerds won. So the textual team won. But then,
Yeah.
and this is coming back to Neoplatonism as an historiographic challenge in the 19th century. By then you have a field of history which is a study of written texts, right?
Yes.
They're
Yes.
not theurgists. They haven't been theurgists for 1500 years. So you
Yes.
have people who are specialized in studying texts, studying the texts of people who think texts are important or more important than theurgy. So this is the kind of bit that is occluded from most people's understanding of the history of the time, where like the nerds won. And we both write books. We're still on the nerd team, right? I love books and text.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about this stuff, there is a line that we think of, and
Yeah.
that's become history, and then the other stuff has sort of been brushed aside. But the case you're building in this book is like, no, that survived as well. It just didn't. It doesn't
Yeah.
survive as text because it wouldn't. Is that fair?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, as late as late 1940s and 1950s, this Oxford professor Dodds, who wrote this book, "The Greeks and the Irrational," was describing theurgy as the refuge of a despairing intelligentsia. Okay, this would be the academic discourse around the theurgic element in antiquity. That basically, while you have this glorious classical civilization, you hit antiquity and it degrades massively for the next 1,000 years. So that was their thesis. Anything theurgical, anything practical was debased,
Yeah.
debased
So
culture.
we have a similar problem with plant medicines and the use of entheogens and drugs and so on, because the Victorians were which is ironic because you could buy cocaine at Harrods, but because the Victorians were kind of prudish, the idea that their intellectual heroes might have been using opium in a ceremonial context was not
Yeah.
allowed, right?
Or
So
indeed
so all
that they
the like magical
or indeed that
stuff.
they would be invoking deities. That was definitely just beyond the pale, unimaginable. And therefore whoever was doing that or promoting it must be a debased thinker. So it not only affected the tradition, it affected their writings and the way the writings were interpreted. So you have then a revisionist Proclus, in which he is kind of you extract out of his writings a version of Platonism that is consistent with the way moderns view Platonism. Okay. And
Right.
with so many steps removed from Plato at this point, it's almost unrecognizable as something Plato would have actually recognized as his own thought.
It's almost equidistant when you get to the 5th century, right? Because it's sort of
Yeah.
1,000 years that way and a
Yeah.
thousand years this way. Like that's what I don't think this. I want to come back to the cosmology we're talking about, right? Because
Mm.
Neoplatonism is this term that was just sort of dumped on a couple of centuries of thought, and if they had names for it, they would have considered themselves Platonists as well. But they're still 700 years after the man in question.
Yeah,
So
indeed.
it's this is a bit where it's a bit kind of challenging for people who are maybe not as familiar
Yeah.
with the evolution of Greek thought. Like we sort of think, oh, Neoplatonists must have been straight after Plato. It's like no, it was
They're not.
centuries later, and it wasn't a term that they used. So
And
what I
the
want to do,
problem with the
go on.
term, Gordon, with Neoplatonism is it puts the emphasis on Plato.
Yeah,
But actually, the teaching of this so-called School of Athens only used parts of Plato for a specific purpose. They had a developmental program called the Ladder of Virtues. And for each step in this ladder, this 7-step ladder, they used one of Plato's texts because it helped to articulate the ideas. So Iamblichus had arranged Plato's text in a sequence, a developmental sequence. And it was only those 7 or 8 texts that were really germane to understand. But the ladder of virtues was a practical spiritual exercise, a series of ascending exercises developing towards union, henosis, with the deity. Okay,
Yeah.
so the Platonic element in that was supplementary reading. The core of the tradition was not Platonic at all. Okay, the core
So
of the
what was it? This is
tradition, if
what I want to
anything,
do.
was the Chaldean oracles.
Here we go, because this is what I want to do, right? I want to talk about the worldview, as far as we can tell, of the time, like Iamblichus, the post-closure moment. So what is that worldview that we can see from 1500 years this side of it?
Yeah,
And because if we can describe what that is, then we can kind of take parts of it forward
yeah.
historically. So if it wasn't Platonism, what, tell me the cosmology that we're talking about here.
Okay, so straight out of the mysteries of Eleusis, you have these families, the Eumolpidae, for instance, going back centuries, and they carry an initiatory lineage that is being given to them directly by the deity. Okay, and it's carried within the family, and that is best understood in contemporary terms with something like the Indo-Tibetan higher yoga tantra, those initiations which are direct introductions to a specific deity. And having had the initiation, your sadhana, your daily practice, devotional practice, reconnects you with the deity on a daily basis. And over a period of time, you kind of cleanse the subtle body, the physical body, your emotional body, and you start to merge with a higher form of consciousness. Now, this is a universal pattern in human culture over thousands of years, and the mystery cults were no exception to it. So we're talking about a core of spiritual discipline to achieve henosis, union with the deity. Now, for most
Correct.
people in this life, that's a tall order. Okay. So they start off on the path and then they drop off it and come back to it and so on. So the tradition is there to maintain a steady connection with the deity and a set of practices that will allow people to connect to the deity. Okay. And that's the tradition that they sought to preserve when Theodosius forbade the practice of the mystery cults, and then subsequently monks came along and destroyed the sanctuary. And now the families who held these positions in um, Eleusis, just outside of Athens, were incredibly wealthy, it has to be said, because they were getting a small proportion of a payment with each initiation every year. Um, so you have the Hierophant and you have his son, Plutarch of Athens, not Plutarch of Chaeronea, Plutarch of Athens, who was a priest of Asclepius. And Plutarch had a daughter, Asclepigenea, and the grandfather and her father set out, probably at a very early age, to initiate her and teach her how to initiate. That's to say, how to convey the core initiation of Eleusis to other people, and then how to teach them to practice theurgy in an effective way that would reunite them with the deity whenever they practiced theurgical ascent. So that's what they actually did, and they shifted the whole operation out of Eleusis into central Athens. And because they had the wealth, they could hire or buy a couple of large properties, the foundations of which still exist, where they situated this. And it's this establishment that's been called the Platonic School of Athens. But as I say, the Platonic element in it was the least important. You know, if you're
So
going to
is
say,
there Platonic parts though? Like, so we've got a connection with God, with a being, and the promise of the Eleusinian mysteries was life after death, right? Like that was what you got for initiating. So there's
well,
a
you've got
component of it.
illumination in the here and now. During the
All right.
course of the initiation, you had illumination. But of course, you can never hold on to it because you don't have the physical and energetic support. You drop back into your selfhood, so to speak.
So, like, these are details that are important, right? So, is there an afterlife? Does it have sort of Platonic layers? Do you know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
what else is in
Okay.
what
So
else is in the
what they're
cosmology?
saying is that when you can secure this relationship to the deity, it continues for all of the lives thereafter. But you are then kind of within the entourage of that deity. So you so to speak, ascend upon death into the deity's entourage, and you choose an incarnation at that point, which will progress the spiritual work. This was the mechanism. So they talked about the golden chain, which is the linked lives of people connected to a higher order being. Okay, serially reincarnating in order to teach. So Proclus certainly identified with certain earlier Pythagoreans, for instance, saw himself as reincarnating with a spiritual purpose. And that was very much the core of the school's thought. And you find it in Plato's Republic, of all places. He says, once you've ascended and you've merged with the deity, what should you do? You have a responsibility to reincarnate, to teach and to continue to develop other people. It's made explicit. It's all there in Plato and in other texts, but they're not the portions that scholarship is interested in.
Yeah,
Scholarship is more interested in what did Plato say about epistemology or ontology, and is he a dualist, and all of this.
yeah.
I hesitate to say nonsense, but that is the way Plato is approached today.
There's a challenge with the sort of Socratic circle at the time, which is they all kind of they're of a certain class, and all would have been part of some kind of mystery tradition, right? So it's almost like your family would enable you, or your family would largely determine the sort of immortality path that you got, right? Like you join a mystery tradition and then you toddle off and do your salon, then you do your
Yeah,
metaphysics with
yeah,
Socrates and his friends. And so
yeah,
the we can't find what Plato, certainly not Socrates, if he existed, but we can't find what uh, Plato kind of really thought about the spiritual world, because it was actually a lot of it is separate to what they wrote and spoke about, which is why it shows up in funny little moments like that, right? Where it's like, oh, you should just
yeah.
reincarnate. Or say, hang on, have you guys sat around and had a long, boring discussion about reincarnation yet? Or is it,
Mm,
and
mm,
they haven't, because it's what I find fascinating is it's kind of taken for granted. This is the bit
yeah,
where I want to be specific about the cosmology that survives, because
yeah,
it's not in the text, because in the same way there actually isn't a single complete story of Horus and Osiris. There's not
yeah,
a full version of that myth written anywhere that we survived from dynastic Egypt, because everyone kind of knew it.
yeah,
So they're like bits that we get,
yeah.
but the full thing isn't there, and we're sort of
Yeah, it's
stuck with that
kind of
when we
scattered,
look.
Gordon. It's kind of scattered through his various
Yeah,
dialogues. That's the
exactly.
problem. It is there, kind of, but the Phaedrus, for
But he
instance,
doesn't
has
sit
the
down and go,
densest.
"Here's how the universe." He doesn't sit down and go, "Here's how the universe works."
No,
Right? That
no,
was
no.
there's not.
But the other thing, Plato doesn't feature in any of these dialogues.
Yeah,
They're all spoken by other people. For instance, the Timaeus, which is perhaps the most profound of the Platonic dialogues, is entirely the thoughts of Timaeus, a Pythagorean visiting Athens.
yeah,
So, Plato is kind of an absent presence in the dialogues. It's Euripides is not in the plays he wrote, or Sophocles in the plays he wrote,
exactly.
and Plato
Yeah,
is an absence, which is another curious feature of so-called Platonism. You can't find Plato saying anything anywhere, but
yeah.
simply recording or making up the speeches of other people. So it's a bit kind of like a Shakespeare character, really.
Well,
Who was
where-
Shakespeare?
yeah. We if you've had I certainly haven't had a classical education or anything, but if you've had an education where you were taught some stuff about Plato or what have you,
Yeah,
what's important for people listening to understand is that we don't know just how magical that worldview was, because we're looking at
Yeah,
texts that people wrote in that worldview. They're not
yeah,
specifically writing about their magical worldview, which is
yeah,
important for our discussion of like, well, let's see what it was and how it survived.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
So back to the
that's the
School of
problem we
Athens.
have. The mystery traditions were secret, and there were
Yeah.
aspects of them which were not only secret, they were literally ineffable. You you couldn't put them into words. Okay, so they had this core of experience that gave meaning to them, which was totally unspeakable.
Yeah.
You could
So then,
describe the sanctuary, you could describe the priests, priestesses there, but you don't touch anything with that. That's like the
yeah.
stage set.
So let's go back to School of Athens and let's talk about, this is a moment of reorganization and attempt to preserve
Yeah,
post closure of schools. So take us to that part of the story. Like, what were they preserving? It's this connection, and if there was anything else, like use of ritual, use of space, any of that kind of stuff that you think they were preserving in the so-called School of Athens. And yeah, pick the story up
yeah,
from there. Oh, and what century are
yeah,
we talking?
absolutely. So, we're now at the fourth century, end of the fourth century. You have the closure of the sanctuaries, the destruction of the sanctuaries. And with the opening of the fifth century, this establishment in Athens starts to function. And it starts to attract some of the most intellectually and spiritually gifted people of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. A huge contingent come from Alexandria. And and the important thing here, this was a mix of men and women. The women have dropped out of this story largely, which is very unfortunate. And yet they were the mainstay of this operation. Asclepigenea, upon the death of the last Hierophant and the death of her father, Plutarch of Athens, became the mainstay of the initiatic tradition for the century. And so, alongside Proclus, who was taking or doing much of the scholarly type teaching, he was her initiate. He got taught theurgy from her, and she taught all the other people, the so called Neoplatonists, theurgy and how to conduct it. So, throughout that century, she served in that role of conveying the initiatic current, teaching the proper practice of theurgy. And that is a missing chapter, probably the greatest of the high priestesses of antiquity in that sense. And Michael Pacellus in the ninth and 10th century was talking about, oh yeah, in Athens you can still obtain the initiation of Kirke, Demeter, in other words. In other words, somehow at her death around 485, she had empowered somebody else to take over. But at that point, the school itself, the establishment in Athens, came under attack again by Christians. And it was forced to break up its collection. We don't know where the books went. And there was a kind of dispersal of the major figures. By that time, it was Damascius was the scholar or head of the school. And the action really shifts to Alexandria at that point because Athens has been, laid waste essentially. They've had all their wealth, their library, they buried some of the cult items in wells, which have been recovered. But it's a very fragmentary history after that in Athens. Very little was
Very
left.
interesting. Yeah, it is. I didn't know that about Michael Sellis, right? Because that's 500 years later, 450 years
Yeah,
later,
yeah,
and in another city.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
wow, I mean, it could have been someone fraudulently offering them in the back alleys of Athens, but it might not be.
It might not
It
be.
might
Yeah,
be.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's a very
that's wrong.
tantalizing clue.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, I couldn't find more substance about it. So yeah,
yeah, interesting.
the action shifted to Alexandria at this point. Um,
Right.
and it was not as
So we
though Alexandria had any less number of belligerent, zealous Christians. It had its fair share. But
yeah, the writing was on the wall
being a
then.
part of Africa, it had this huge Egyptian tradition. And Proclus's greatest student, Ammonius, was from Alexandria and returned there and started teaching at the school of Apollo. And the family of Hor Apollo were a native Egyptian initiatic family who were conducting the rites of Isis and continuing with that tradition. And in fact, throughout the Nile Valley, all the way up to Karnak, the rites of Amun were still being practiced at the great temple of Amun. So Christianity had a new challenge in that region of the world. It was not so easy to kind of bulldoze, although they certainly attempted, they did their best. And so
Yeah.
you find Olympiodorus still teaching core text of this reincarnatory metaphysics as late as the mid 6th century. And really, it's
Right.
with his death around then that the Christianity absorbs the teaching of the alternative tradition.
Yeah. So let's get a definition. Let's maybe wind it back. Let's get a definition of theurgy, because again, this I think is important. So I'll give you my definition and I'll see what you think, right? So theurgy is the use of bodies, body movement, and things to aid in your in the elevation of your soul towards this apotheotic point, right? So it's we could say ritual magic can often have prosaic goals, but theurgy, in theory, should be singularly focused on the elevation of the soul, either up through various spheres or what have you, towards some kind of union. But crucially, it's not something that can be done just with thought, just with like reading the right text and contemplating. Theurgy is
Okay.
the use of being in a body and arranging things so that it has an
Okay.
effect. What do you think to that?
The magical paradigm tends to break down when we talk about theurgy, at least in my mind. Okay, because the magical paradigm has the will of the mage as its kind of core. That's the agency. In theurgy, the less you're in it, the better. Okay, the less of you there is, the better for the outcome. And Proclus said there were 3 requirements for henosis, for union with the divine. The first one is the providential agency of the deity. So, through the ladder of virtues, you assimilate your own qualities to those of the deity that you wish to unite with. And that's a devotional practice that has to be ongoing. There needs to be what he calls an aptitude or a capacity to receive the union with the deity. And that means you've assimilated yourself as much as you can to the core qualities of the deity. And finally, there needs to be commensurability and concord. You need to be agreeable to the deity. Okay, so the idea, and I think Iamblichus says it, it's the will of the gods to reveal themselves, to appear bodily, to, you know, there's a desire for union on both sides. And that's the core of theurgy. Okay, so the god wants to reach out and absorb you. You want to be absorbed. So it's an apathetic way, as you say. It's a way of self-negation, of letting go. So it stands as a kind of, polar opposite of magic in that sense, as
No,
as a
I don't think
practice.
so. I think not from a material analysis. Like because we're going to start talking about architecture, which is a thing, right?
Yeah,
And it's a thing designed to have an effect. So that's what I was getting at, right? Like, so that's all well and good that the goal, there's like a dual desire union, but on the
yeah.
part of the human, there are things we do, making sure that if it's a Venusian, right, the stuff around you is Venusian. Like, that's what I mean. Like
Well, again,
that
that's
is
very magical thinking, Gordon,
sure.
because one of the practices, for instance, was to bury yourself. So only your head is out of the ground. So you're kind of emulating having died. That's what I was saying.
That's
Yeah, it's on
ritual.
like the devotional side of things rather than you can pile up Sunta Metta, Symbola.
No, but that's it.
They are
That's
relevant.
sorry. Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
go
That's
on.
a death ceremony. You know what I mean? Like that's still a ritual. We're actually
Yeah,
we are
oh,
talking about the same.
absolutely.
And,
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
That's kind of what I mean because if we
yeah, right. I
go on.
got you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely ritualistic. No doubt about it. Yeah. But
Because if we're
I
going
say,
to make the case, if we're going to make the case that something from this moment ends
yeah,
up in this very peculiar building in Constantinople, the motive for that has to be because the people who did it
yeah,
believed that arranging
yeah.
physical things will have an effect. But that's the
Okay.
key that I
So,
was trying to get at. Yeah.
okay. So what we're looking at now is this notion of visual culture in antiquity, the way in which they framed things in their worldview, which is radically different from the way we think. So they had some core concepts, one of which acheiropoiesis, that's to say that the patterns within nature, within stones, were placed there by spiritual
Mm.
beings and therefore conveyed a meaning and a message. There's a kind of panpsychism here and a pantheism. That's to say, everything is alive and everything is ordered in hierarchies of spiritual being. That's kind of implicit. So when you have that as your starting point, um, marble, for instance, takes on a new meaning because it is densely patterned. And when you cut it in certain ways, and it's called book matching, um, let me explain that because it's quite central to this idea that you can assemble material objects that have a spiritual effect. Okay, so not only are the patterns meaningful, placed there by spiritual beings, when they take a block of marble and they slice it just like you'd slice a loaf of bread, and then they would polish the front of the first slice and the back of the second, and front of the third, back of the fourth, and so right through. And then you take all these panels and lay them out, and you find that when you place them adjacent to each other, they generate different patterns. And so you now have, so from Sunta Meta, which is the spiritual essence natural to an object, as you say, something devoted to a deity, a specific deity, a color, an incense, a pattern in the marble and its color. Um, by placing several of these together, you then develop a symbola, which is to say an articulation. And this is closer to what you would do in ritual, where you assemble things related to the articulation of your purpose, right? And that's what they were doing with the building. Okay, so they were cutting these marbles which had these patterns in, which were in placed there by spiritual entities, and they were assembling in a way which would generate a higher form of meaning, which was also a spiritual force. It wasn't just a metaphysical lesson. It was actually
Yeah.
a force that would act. And similarly, the way in which light is dealt with um, affects the energy body, so that light is infused with spirit, as is sound. Okay, so what we're talking about now is we need to talk about who the designers were,
Yeah.
what their
That's
intellectual and spiritual milieu was, and how that affected the way they went about dealing with materials and towards what end. Okay,
so. Actually,
so
before we go there, let's do the official story of how and why this building was built in the first place. Like, tell the kind of official story of why it
well,
was built and where.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, we have to touch on who Justinian was, and basically, his uncle was a swineherd from the Balkans. Huge guy, 6'6", built like, and he joined the Praetorian Guard, walked all the way to Constantinople, got in the Praetorian Guard, rose through the ranks, and then through a shrewd manipulation and murder and bribery, launched himself upon the uh, empire. He became the emperor. Okay, but he was a literate swineherd, basically. But his nephew, Justinian, he made sure had a theological education. Now, the problem for this dynasty is they had no roots. And at that time, Constantinople still had its aristocratic families. And one family in particular could trace its, several generations of Roman emperor in its ancestry. So there was a crisis of legitimacy for Justinian. And not only that, that family built this massive church on a ridge overlooking Constantinople that was modeled after the Temple of Solomon. And within this church, this massive church, they had this kind of stonework which declared their lineage, all the emperors that had preceded the family members. So this is kind of, almost from anywhere in the city you could look up and see this. And for Justinian, with the crisis of legitimacy that he had and faced by a major uprising in 532, he had to stamp his authority. And one way he did it, of course, was a massacre of the people who rose up against him. I think 50,000 or so were butchered in the hippodrome adjacent to the palace. And there was a massive fire, and various churches got burnt down. And one of them was the previous Hagia Sophia church. Okay, so he took the opportunity after the riots of stamping his authority on the city by building a church that would exceed the one built by the aristocratic families. So that on a political level, that's how it came about that he needed to erect this. And he needed
And
to
it
erect.
and like my
So,
memory of learning about this in school was that when it was completed, he walked inside and apparently said, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," which is
yeah, because
not
the
a great.
aristocrats had declared that their church was better than Solomon.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you had to
It's
say it.
yeah. It's a really good ritual magic act, like just as an aside, right? Because you're putting
Yeah,
yourself in resonance with the archetype of a Christian king. Well, Jewish, but like Christian king. You're putting
yeah,
yourself
right.
in resonance. Solomon had a big ass temple, and he
Yeah,
was the best king. So I'm going to
yeah,
have a big ass temple. That
yeah,
you follow the logic and go, all right, Justinian, I see what you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah. But knowing
Anyway,
that the aristocrats had done it before him is relevant. He had to exceed what they had done. Okay, and that church went into a mysterious decline after the 532 Nika riots. It's like everything, all the lead and gold was stripped out of it. And right now, today, all there is a massive hole in the ground where it used to stand, which is quite unusual for a Byzantine church. Most of them are standing and are still in use today, whether as mosques or museums. But that is just a hole in the ground. So clearly, he made sure it didn't stay around after his own church was built. So yeah, that's how the project was given unlimited wealth and urged on as fast as possible to be completed. That's the genesis of the project.
and
The
what do we know
problem
about the
he
actual?
had, sorry,
Yeah, what do we
I
know
was
about the
going to say,
actual art?
okay, before we touch that, the problem he had is that the Christian elite around him were generally taught theology, and that was not the learning tradition necessary to achieve great engineering feats. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire was split and remains split throughout its history between two traditions, one rooted in the classics and the other rooted in theology. And of course, all the civil service had the classical tradition of learning. All the engineers, all the professionals, the lawyers, the teachers, the academicians, all started with Homer and read through the classical. Okay, the Christian ruling elite had all, if they were not illiterate, were well versed in theology. And so they absolutely depended upon people who were essentially Hellenists in their secret lives to achieve anything, to run the civil service, to manage the army, and to build edifices like the Hagia Sophia. It couldn't be possible without dipping into that Hellenistic tradition of learning and education. And that was their fatal problem. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to preface.
That's good because like so what do we know about the the intentionality of some of the artisans and the arrangement that we look at. So, because is it a secret? Is it a secret project, or was Justinian kind of in on it? Like, well, we can actually make this into a temple that will elevate people's souls in the way that, if 4 centuries later, we start to get with the cathedrals in Western Europe, designed to actually have a physical effect on you because of proportionality and sound and so on. Was he read in on that, or was this something else
No,
going on?
as far as he was concerned, he was sold a concept. Um, he was concerned that it would be grandiose, of course, and that it would be done quickly. But they appear to have sold him a concept whereby it would not have any embedded Christian imagery whatsoever, which is extraordinary. Because if you compare it with the Christian edifices in Ravenna, for instance, the Byzantine capital in Italy, every one of them is covered from floor to ceiling with Christian imagery. There's none whatsoever in Hagia Sophia, and that's extraordinary for the most important church of Christendom. It had no structural Christian imagery until like quarter century after its completion. That's extraordinary fact. How they sold this to him, I don't know, but they did. And what they appear to have had as a concept is that if we don't have any imagery embedded in it, we can make it into a pure reflective surface for
Mhm.
light and sound. Okay. So that is the core concept. But underneath that, they slipped in very clever use of marble patterning. And nobody has noticed this before I wrote this book, that the marble patterning has clear and distinct references to certain texts of Plato that deal with the afterlife. Okay. So at this point, we're going to slip into, let's talk a little bit about the architects before we talk about what they actually did.
Sure.
Um, there were like 3 levels of engineer in the ancient world. Um, they would be like at the bottom, master builders, and then above that, you have what we would probably call professional architects, and above that you have the most experienced intellectuals who would be doing fundamental scientific research and who would be brought in on the largest and most complicated projects. Okay, these were called mechanicos. And the 2 people chosen to do the Hagia Sophia were mechanicos. Um, their education. Now, earlier we talked about Alexandria and how it became the focal point for the tradition of this school of Athens. It was conveyed there by Ammonius, who was Proclus's chief student, and Ammonius's successor, Eutychius. Now, these 2 are better known in the world of mathematics and geometry than they are for Hellenistic metaphysics. The designers of the Hagia Sophia were their students. So there's a direct line from Eutychius and Ammonius straight back to Proclus, and from Proclus straight back to the
Mhm.
mysteries of Eleusis. That's the tradition. And that's what there was an essay about this written by Anthony Caldeus. He explored the background of the designers and helped to put this information in place. And it was this fact that really triggered me to start looking at the building in a new way. I figured if you were given the task of building a monumental architecture, the first thing you'd have to think about is what theme are we going to use in the design? Okay, what is like the master narrative here? Um, and that caused me to look back through the tradition and understand that the master theme of theurgy, as I say, is this encounter with the afterlife and the mechanism for subsequent ascent and incarnation. So I think, well, if you were going to do anything, it would have that kind of background to it. And because I live here, I can visit the building every day if I want to. Okay. And especially at the time when it was still a museum, you could see everything. And I started exploring the surfaces. And it suddenly dawned on me what they'd done. We talked about how with book matched marble you can generate patterns. And they had thematically generated a whole series of patterns that covered the floor and the revetment, that's to say, the four massive pillars that hold the building up, all the way to the gallery. And thereupon, it suddenly turns into a floral meadow theme. I thought there must be somewhere where there's a master narrative generating this imagery. And sure enough, there was. I found it in Pindar, of all places. Some of the earliest Hellenistic poetry, his second Olympian, describes the afterlife in exactly this form. And that's when the penny dropped. They had created the Hellenistic pagan afterlife as the theme through the clever cutting and placement of marble. So we have this vast marble floor, which everyone says resembles a sea. And across it, there's four green bands of marble inlaid into it. And everyone has been puzzled, what are these four bands? Well, the answer is in Plato's Gorgias, where he describes the structure of the underworld. He describes it as this watery place, and within that, there are four rivers. And each of those rivers has a specific purificatory role for the souls that are sent down to Tartarus. So what we're looking at is the underworld represented in marble. And then I looked at the revetment, and it's quite clear to me, visiting the Kora in Istanbul or looking at the revetment in Ravenna, and the same architects and designers worked on Hagia Sophia and the edifices in Ravenna. They were the same people. But in Ravenna, they're beautiful Rosetta patterns. So they like place four marble slabs together and it makes beautiful. It's all very, very nice, And I was looking at the revetment of Hagia Sophia, and there was these like arachnid forms, like scorpions. And it was incredible. There were like six of these on each of the four massive pillars. It was so intensely thematic. And so I searched and searched, and I found that the root of this appears to have been in astronomy, accounting for the relationship between Scorpio and Orion in the sky. So Scorpio arises and chases Orion. That's how the story is told in the basic quadrivium in astronomy. So that's a mnemonic for understanding the astronomy. But the original myth, of course, is the scorpion is sent as retributive justice to kill Orion because of his arrogance. He rapes various people, attempts to rape Artemis. He boasts that he can kill every single living creature on the planet. He's such a great hunter. And it's that point that Earth sends the scorpion to kill him. So the scorpion really has in that culture a clear role as a symbol of retributive justice. And that was another building block in building a narrative, recovering the thematic narrative of the building's designers. Okay,
Yeah,
I can go
it's
on if you like.
no. I need to let some of that settle in because I think it comes. What I'm trying to find how Justinian. I'm just speculating. And got sold. Maybe not exactly this, but like, well, we'll build you a stone machine. Here's what I've got. This is a
Yeah,
guess or a hypothesis, right? Which is if he was not versed in the church fathers in the same way that the elite families were, he would have faced. You can't win in a situation like this. Okay, cool. Well, we'll make this uh, the Church of Saint Helena. It's like, oh, he picked Saint Helena. That's a stupid one to pick. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no way he'd win in a theological temple because there will be people there who know more than him, and and so there's sort of an end run around those discussions where it's like, well, we could. What if we have
yeah.
none of it? What if we make
Okay.
it a temple?
Let,
Do you know what I
let
mean?
me add. Okay,
Yeah,
let
go
me
on.
add two things to that, Gordon. Firstly, Christianity was still split amongst a number of major sects. So, like, down in Alexandria, they had a flavor of Christianity. Over in Asia Minor, there was another flavor. In Constantinople, still another. And in the Balkans, and his problem was unification. He wanted to hold this lot together. So, the more neutral the Christian imagery that would be deployed, the better chance he had, because his ideation was towards the empire. So he made sure that they brought marbles from every point of the empire and had them displayed there. This was about imperial grandeur, as far and unifying a very disparate empire at a time when it was split into so many factions. So as long as you could satisfy those aspirations, that he's done basically.
Yeah.
How
So
they want to.
you
He
mentioned,
wouldn't have had access to
um,
the Plato's text, for instance. He wouldn't have been able to decode it. I mean, 100 years of scholarship has not decoded this. This is
all
the
right.
first time this is being articulated, that the building
Yeah.
has a thematic design based on Hellenistic afterlife.
It's not just the marble either, is it? Like you mentioned, the sound and light and
Yeah,
so on. So
yeah,
there's extra components to it. I'm quite struck by the sort of flowers at the top. That's yeah.
yeah.
It's
That's
definitely
that's the meadow of judgment. That's where the souls initially go for judgment. So he placed that mosaic exactly where the royal family would have been seated. So for the Hellenists in the court attending mass, they would have looked down, saw the representation of the underworld, saw the royal family sitting in the meadow of judgment, these tyrants, as far as the Hellenists were concerned, as that would have been the most appropriate way of introducing a counter narrative to the tyranny that they were otherwise subjecting the Hellenistic population to.
yeah.
It's an interesting political maneuver as well. It's
So
like in the.
talk about the other ritual components, like the sound and the light and so
Okay,
on. That
yeah.
the complete picture.
So what that brings us to is the original dome, which was at least 10 meters lower than the one that's there now. And what they did is they would take a large sheet of glass and cover it with gold foil, real gold, and another one with silver, for instance, and then put another sheet of glass on top of these and bake them in the oven. When they fuse, they will cut them up into small 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter tesserae, and then place these into the sills that let light into the dome. So the silvered surface would reflect light up onto the dome, and they covered the dome in the gold tesserae. So, like 180 per square meter, every one of them individually angled to create a mirror. So the light coming in would flood up, hit the dome, and then be reflected as a golden glow into the naos, into the huge chamber. And that itself, again, according to antique visual or visual culture, would be actually embodying the spiritual energy of the divinity. Okay, it would have a physical, so to speak, manifestation. And Procopius, who saw it, talks about this golden glow in the naos. It's as though you were so close to the divine. It's kind of infused the building. Um, and on top of that, the reflections in each of the domes and semi-domes and exedra, the small domes off the semi-domes, there were choir stands, so that on all levels you would be able to fill the space with choirs singing. Now, because of the characteristics, the acoustic signature of the building is such that there's a natural reverberation or sustain of something like 12 to 14 seconds. And in a performance space, that is very excessive. Normally, a
Yeah.
performance space would have like a 2 second sustain on it. Once you get 12, 14 seconds, so that the sound is like echoing, bouncing off these hard surfaces back and forth, it turns more into like when you hum the various chakras.
Mm.
The words are lost. Only the melody and its dynamic range is captured and echoed back and forth. And there is a beautiful recording of Stanford's choir singing a Byzantine hymn into a electronic reproduction of the acoustics of Hagia Sophia. It's called Icons of Sound, and it's on YouTube. And I strongly recommend people listen to that, because that gives you more immediately than anything I can say what the experience of being in there would have been like.
Yeah. See, that's another one that's plainly deliberate, because if I'd commissioned a church, I would not want to have a 12 or 14-second reverb. That's, you've built
Yeah.
my church wrong at that point, right? That's insane. So there's that is plainly deliberately built into it. You don't go like, oh, whoops, I guess we made it. You literally building for that effect. You know what I mean? And that
Okay.
means it has to be baked into it in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's compelling.
Yeah. So in this case, the spiritual effect of sound triumphs over the words that are being sung.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it becomes this immersive experience of light and sound. It's multi-sensory aesthetic. And this is an incredibly sophisticated design concept for late antiquity. I mean, I don't think there's anything after Hagia Sophia can even begin to compare with this. But it shows the kind of summit of engineering and intellectual capacity of the Hellenistic tradition before it was trounced by Christianity. This was its last gasp, and what a fine
Well,
gasp it was.
I heard it for a subsequent 14 seconds. But it's funny you say this was the last gasp, right? Now,
Yeah.
one of my other questions, because I thought this is really interesting to follow from um, the lineage of the builders and architects, and we modern words, but the lineage of them into this post mystery school meta-philosophical world. Did they do anything else? Do you know what I mean? Do we have other things that uh, do we have other children from this moment other than Hagia Sophia, right? Like that we can look at and go, well, they also, that looks like they're probably involved in it in some way. Obviously, not in the grandiosity of a temple built for an emperor to emulate King Solomon, but are there other kind of through lines after that moment into built culture or something anywhere else in Europe?
Well, I think there's something far more valuable was pulled through, and it surfaces, as I mentioned earlier, with Michael Purcellus in 9th and 10th century and the circle around him, which is the recovery of the liturgical tradition. Okay. And again, that was pulled through, and we see it in Platon, in George Gemistus in the 15th century, the complete rehabilitation of Hellenistic ritual practices. And as displayed in the Solar Busker, the liturgical rites are resurrected in the 15th century. That's remarkable. So
Yeah.
even if the initiatic lineage is broken in the sense of human to human transmission, if you accept that the deity is a player in that development, then the ability to reconnect to a lineage by somebody who's sufficiently devout and, so to speak, resurrect a valid initiatory tradition should be possible. And I believe that's what happened with Platon. He was totally dedicated to the resurrection of Hellenism, to its supplanting Christianity, actually. And that's what he went set about doing amongst the Italian elite. So the Solar Busker is the evidence for
Oh, I see what
the
you mean. Yeah.
continuity of a liturgical tradition.
So coming back to Michael Psellos, right? Was Hagia Sophia the, because he was in Constantinople, right? Was that
Yeah.
the still the official church in his day? Like, would he be going to church on Sunday at Hagia Sophia? As
Oh,
far as we
yeah,
know,
definitely. Yes, yeah.
that because that
Yeah,
would
it
have been state, so he
continued
would have
right
been there.
through until the Latin destruction of Constantinople in 1204, I think. The
Okay, cool.
crusade was diverted by the Venetians and laid siege to Constantinople rather than going on to Jerusalem. And they
Yeah.
sacked the city um, to such an extent that actually, when the Ottoman armies came by in the 15th century, they just bypassed the city. It wasn't worth the candle. They
Yeah.
went on up into the Balkans. They created their capital in Edirne, well north of Constantinople. It was years later before they returned to claim Constantinople. But the Latin conquest had pretty well destroyed the city as a economic and spiritual and artistic hub. I mean, everything was carted away. The lead from the roofs, every bit of gold and silver they could lay hands on, every statue, there's like scattered throughout Europe now. So it was actually the Latins themselves who brought about the downfall of Constantinople. It was just a shell in 1453 when the Ottomans took it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Good bit of
1204 then would be the end date for the Hagia Sophia. Pretty well. I
I'm just
guess they continue to have services there, but
yeah.
the spirit
Because
had
I was just
gone.
I'm taken by the idea of Michael Psellis going to mass or church on Sunday or whatever, and being bathed
Yeah.
in the light, the sound. Like that's
But
cool. That's
okay,
yeah.
well the problem is that there was a series of earthquakes about 25 years after the inauguration of the building, and there was a partial failure on one of the semi-domes. And when they looked at the task of repairing this, they decided they would redo the main dome with a much higher pitch so that it would be more secure in the future. And
Right.
essentially, when they did that, they did a ribbed um, vault. A dome is a vault, a form of vaulting, and they did a ribbed form so that it had inbuilt structure. So that flat, smooth surface that had been the mirror previously disappeared from history at that point. And they had this gold covered, high pitched dome, which kind of pale reflection of what it had been, you know.
Oh,
They
wow.
lost the
Kind of
glow.
like yeah. That's a pity. So that's one particular. I'm really interested in this, right? And I think for people who are unaware, the grimoire tradition, picking up the story a third of the way through it, admittedly, but the European grimoire tradition came back into Europe, I suppose is the way to say it, from Constantinople, and
Oh,
Agamistus
yes. Yeah.
Platon is part of it, right? So
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see some of the streams that flowed into Constantinople, but then flowed
Mm.
out 5 centuries
Yeah.
later, right? Flowed in,
Yeah.
built this amazing model of, well, an improvement on Solomon's temple, and then
Yeah.
if a scant few centuries later, coming out of that city, and the books are even called Solomonic, right? But like the
Mm.
grimoire tradition comes out of it, so it's a remarkable
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. It was a great moment of
Really.
preservation of traditions, things like the Picatrix and so on. Even if they came into Europe in a rather roundabout way, I mean, they were translated into Arabic because, of course, on the back of this, you have the rise of Islam. So whatever the Christians had done in Alexandria was just, like a tidal wave of Islam flooded across North Africa and throughout the Middle East. But that, in a sense, was far more adaptive than Christianity. It assimilated more of the ancient traditions than Christianity wanted to. So you have this great preservation within Islamic culture of the core magic, not of theurgy perhaps, but certainly the magical tradition was there, and then conveyed into Europe through the back door, so to speak. So it would be coming in through Constantinople and Spain.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
It's yeah. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the book that you can you can where you're living now. Can you see Hagia Sophia?
I can if I go down towards the coast. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's just it's fun to that I like. I like that you could kind of have been looking at
Yeah,
it for 20 years. You know,
yeah.
uh, yeah,
Haven't been going in every day, I have to confess, but I spend
well,
many hours in there just perusing it. There's one aspect of the design we didn't discuss, Gordon, which I can just throw in at the end.
yeah,
The
go for it.
building is aligned on the winter solstice, and that may have some functional purpose because a lot of Roman buildings were aligned on winter solstice. Apparently, it gave a better spread of light during the winter months. Okay, but it also has a symbolic purpose. And when I started examining the southerly pier, the massive pier that holds the building up, I found that one of the um, marble panels, the revetment, had been fashioned to look like Capricorn. And that suddenly struck me as incredibly appropriate because Capricorn is in the southern solstice. And we know from Porphyry and from Plato that the gate of the sun by which souls ascend is in Capricorn. He describes that in his Cave of the Nymphs book when he's describing Mithraic imagery. And then when I looked on the other side of the pillar next to the Capricorn, I found these very curious panels built into the fabric, which had the insignia of Poseidon. That seemed absolutely incredible that a building that had no inbuilt Christian imagery whatsoever, nevertheless, had plaques to Poseidon built into the structure, into the fabric. I thought, well, that cannot be a coincidence. So, sure enough, I started digging back through Proclus's writing. And, they have all these elaborate hierarchies, triads of deities. And sure enough, Poseidon is there as the guide of souls. And that also confirmed me that the tradition of the designers had come through Alexandria from Athens, preserving the same metaphysical. So the guide of souls, the southerly gate of the sun by which souls ascend out of materiality, are all gathered there in that corner, southerly pillar.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, that
Um,
nobody has solved that one before. It's still a kind of puzzle. What are these images doing here? Are they even images? Because it's revetment, because it's natural marble paneling. Nobody takes their representational or figurative um, analysis seriously. That's
yeah,
just how
sure.
marble is. It's so easy
Yeah,
to.
no.
And if you're not looking for a thematic unity, you easily miss it.
And what's important to again sort of reemphasize is that there was no other imagery in the church, so that there is a decision. It's not like not necessarily pareidolia where you're sort of just seeing patterns that aren't there because you're not looking at the pictures. There are no
Yeah,
pictures, right?
yeah,
Which means
yeah,
it's a deliberate design decision to
yes,
convey message with stone,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
so you have to kind of meet them halfway on that and go, well, they went, the angle they took was, we're not going to have any pictures, we're going to tell this
yeah,
story with stone. So
yeah,
that's what you should be looking at. That stands to reason as far as I'm concerned.
yeah. And the consistency of the design, in a sense, underlines that there's a thematic intent at work here.
Yeah,
It
no,
is
definitely.
remarkably uniform.
It's, again, I go back to this imaginary scenario in my head of justifying it to Justinian, and the winter solstice is also Christmas, right? So you can kind of go, well, it points at Christmas. Do you know what I mean? We get the good light. It points at Christmas.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
yeah,
the
carry
best light in there. Yeah, yeah. That's optimal light all day long. The sun passes over that way, and off there you
on. Nice
go.
one. Well, I mean, I learned a bunch of stuff, not just about Hagia Sophia, obviously, which I didn't know that much about. Although I used, as a kid, I in the VHS days, I got some National Geographic or Time magazine VHS tape of like the wonders of the world, and it had
Yeah.
Versailles and it had Hagia Sophia in it, and I watched that video 50 times.
Wow.
I think so.
Wow.
I have this very 1992, I guess. No, it'd be a bit old. 1993, 94 VHS vision of Hagia Sophia. Which, yeah, when Peter and Narcissus told me about the book, and I'm like, oh, cool, that's actually that's triggered something in a childhood memory of this sort of remarkable place. But what my point was more that, as with your other books, I learned a whole bunch of stuff about the antique period, about antiquity, that I didn't know before. I didn't know that stuff
Right.
about the School of Athens. And what was the name again? I wrote it down. Asclepiademia.
Asclepiademia.
Yeah, didn't know
Because her
about her.
father was the priest of Asclepius in Athens, she
Yeah,
was named Asclepiademia. And yeah,
yeah,
one of the greatest women um, spiritual leaders of antiquity. She's almost unknown. It's extraordinary.
yeah. She's not the only one. That does, unfortunately. But no, it was, yeah, a fascinating read from the beginning, and kind of like laying out the scene with the rites of Eleusis and the School of Athens and so on before actually moving into it. So it was another, yeah, another exciting page turner. So well done.
Thank you. Thank you very
And
much.
what else you got going on? What else is happening other than the book, which of course is linked up in the show notes for people listening or watching along? But what else have you got going on? Where can people find you, and so on?
Okay, well, I've just completed the foreword to Dara Mason's book on the Dark Man of the Witch's Sabbath. So that will hopefully be coming out from Inner Traditions at some point. I'm not sure when exactly, but that is on the way. Um, and I'm currently working on a book, The Cult of Saturn, which will, so to speak, extend the metaphysical pursuit of this cult of Saturn through from the Renaissance into early modern Europe, um, looking at it in a more diverse and more dispersed way. So that'll be getting work done for the next 6 months, I would say.
Very
And
good.
then hopefully I'm going to be dealing with something to do with Egypt
Oh,
and
excellent.
the initiatory rites.
Very good. Oh, I look forward
Yes.
to that. And
Yeah.
and if people want to know more about yourself, or catch up,
PeterMarkAdams.com, or just type my name
excellent,
into Google. Google me. I have a
nice one.
YouTube
Well,
channel.
oh, excellent. That'll be in the show notes as
Yeah.
well. But yeah, no,
Yeah. Okay.
once again, a fascinating read. Really, really, really enjoyable stuff. And like I said, same thing with it's you're right. My first, before we even met, I don't know if I told you this, but before we ever met, when Starships was just coming out and
Mm.
Scarlet Imprint was still in the Welsh borders, and I drove up, and we got drunk and high and chatted about books. And he told me, oh, I've got this manuscript from this guy in Istanbul who thinks he's found, like, almost like the real Illuminati. It's like there's an
Yeah.
elite Platonic cult reflected in the evidence for which is found in the Solar Busca Tarot, sort of
Yeah.
getting around the Venetian and North Italian elite. And I'm like, wow, that
Yeah.
he says it's not really stuff. And so, but it's always that kind of like, oh yeah, so Peter Mark Adams is writing a book on the tarot. I was, not really. It wasn't really. And it was the same thing. Now Peter Mark Adams is writing a book about Hagia Sophia. Not really. Like it is in the same way. You have these books that are like sneaky. It's like, oh, this is going
Yeah.
to be about Hagia Sophia, and then it's
Yeah.
not. It's that same kind of sacred Hellenistic
Yeah.
survival stuff. Really, really
Yeah.
tricksy and well done. All right. Well, I have kept you long enough. And as I said, great work on the book. And
Thank
all
you.
the details are in the show notes for people,
Yeah.
listening. And
Lovely to talk to you, Gordon. Always a pleasure.
absolutely. And all the best to Kenzie once again.
Yeah, will do.